My name is Robin Wright. I'm a senior fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace, as well as the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm here at the World Affairs Council in Houston to talk about the challenge of Iran and the two different trends that have emerged inside Iran 30 years after its revolution. The first trend is the regime's increasing militarization, its crackdown on its own people that has increased since the disputed presidential election in 2009. The second trend is the emergence of a genuine people power movement in Iran that has been willing to turn out in the streets to challenge the regime. It's faced a severe crackdown during 2010, and yet the sentiment challenging the regime is still very strong. And it's an issue now of how it regroups, how it moves forward, and who its leadership is, because it doesn't have a strategic plan. But it's clear that even though they're not on the streets today, that Iranians are still very dissatisfied with the regime and the difficulties they've had in daily life, not just politically, but economically and socially too. The United States has a particular challenge right now in how to deal with Iran. It wants to do two things at the same time, and they don't always work together. One avenue is to challenge Iran on its nuclear program, to try to ensure that a peaceful nuclear energy program does not become subverted into manufacture of the world's deadliest weapon. The other trend is on human rights, and to try to encourage the regime to not engage in what are today chronic abuses, whether it's imprisonment, detention, execution, challenging people, harassing people on the streets, and trying to get Iran to engage, and trying to get the regime also to improve its human rights records, sometimes come into conflict because what is your priority? And it's obviously the world is concerned about security issues, but the opposition in Iran is doing many of the things the United States would like to see happen. They've put on the table issues of credible elections, transparency, accountability by government officials, and real justice. I am delighted to be back in Houston.
There are quite a few questions about the Green Movement, so we'll band them together. What do the majority of Iranians, do you think, support the Green Movement? What are the chances of Green Movement taking over eventually? Is it active and just underground?
Not so many. I don't have that good memory.
Okay.
Okay, the Green Movement in general has been quashed for the moment. Its leaders, a former Prime Minister and a former Speaker of Parliament, have not been very good in developing a strategy, what to do in the aftermath. I think that there is probably stronger sentiment behind political change in Iran than there was even during that first outburst, because everybody has an uncle, a cousin, a brother, or some relative who has been detained, harassed, or whatever by the regime. People are often called in for long questioning, and it just puts you on edge. A lot of young people, want to leave because they just feel that they don't have an economic future, but they also feel that politically the dangers of saying anything, speaking their mind, which was not true during the reform era, it just makes them too vulnerable. So, long term, I'm a great believer that economics is the key influence in changing societies. I lived in Southern Africa for 7 years and watched as an apartheid regime fell apart because it could no longer afford apartheid. It had three of everything: public restrooms, schools, clinics, roads, suburbs, for whites, blacks, and this strange mixed group they call coloreds. In the end, apartheid was not viable economically. At the end of the day, the Soviet Union also imploded because it couldn't compete. Communism couldn't compete in a globalizing world. And I think Iran faces the same kind of challenges. And they're supposed to remove these subsidies this fall. In fact, it's long overdue. But they haven't done it, I suspect, because they fear a political backlash or an economic, a backlash as prices soar. The average income per family in Iran is about $3,600. They get about $4,000 in subsidies. That's more than they make. And it's a 5-year plan to slowly pull back on subsidies for basic commodities. But that means 5 years of this uncertainty. And I think that the regime is most vulnerable on economics, not because of sanctions, not because of what we did, but because of their own mismanagement, corruption, and dealing with giving contracts to the Revolutionary Guards rather than to a business community that may be better at carrying out some of these contracts.
Then following through, do you think the United States, or what could the United States have done to further the Green Movement or help the Iranian protesters? Anything?
Well, that's a great question, and I've thought about that a lot. I get asked about that a lot, but at the end of the day, because the United States was so involved in 1953 in organizing a coup against a democratically elected government, the Shah had fled to Rome, and the U.S. and British intelligence orchestrated these rent-a-crowd protests that forced out the prime minister, a man named Mossadegh, and brought the Shah back, put him back on the throne. And most Americans know nothing about this incident. I can tell you, I'm sure 90+% of Iranians know about this. And they're very nervous about American intentions. And the minute we do something to help publicly talk about the Green Movement, it will be harder to get the Iranian regime to the table, but it also taints all the opposition movement participants and makes them vulnerable to being charged with being American spies. Even though they may have never talked to an American, never took a penny, whatever, they become vulnerable. At the same time, the U.S. can do a lot in talking about human rights. And one of the great disappointments from the diplomacy that happened in Geneva over the last 2 days is that the United States had counted on bilateral talks, the top American delegate with the top Iranian delegate, so they could bring up bilateral issues, the things that we're concerned about, like human rights. And the Iranians did not agree to a bilateral meeting, which everyone assumed would happen. So we run out of kind of options of what we can do, and the danger is we jeopardize the Green Movement. It's a very delicate balancing act, and that's why I said these two forces that are there that we're dealing with today. One, the bad boys with their alleged nuclear program, and then on the other, the Green Movement, whom we want to help. We want to see, we want to see a fair election, votes counted fairly, and how do you do one without the other? And I think it is harder today than at any time since the revolution to deal with Iran because of these competing forces. All of a sudden, we see there's a different kind of Iran out there, that there isn't this uniform backing for theocratic rule. We want to give that a chance to breathe. And the danger is whose clock is moving the fastest. You have the Israeli clock that's moving the fastest because of the existential threat as they see it. There's the UN clock where you have Russia and China holding back on sanctions because China today gets 12% of its oil from Iran and is a very important trading partner. Russia, which is building the nuclear reactor, Iran's first nuclear reactor for energy, they're not as excited about a kind of clampdown. So it's a real challenge finding the right formula to deal with the regime and convince them to cooperate with the international community.
And finally, tell us how we can download the Iran Primer. That's a great program.
Very simple. It's just www.iranprimer.com, and it has all 62 chapters on the homepage. It has the 4 latest commentaries on the top. You can find it. As I said, if you're interested, you can find chapters on the Revolutionary Guards, on the bazaar, on sanctions, on Iran and Russia, Iran and China. We have 12 chapters just on Iran's relationship with neighbors. It's very user-friendly. I edited every piece. And I said we want it accessible to everyone from a high school or college student all the way up to a specialist at the National Security Council. Heavily fact-based analysis and a way to kind of, it's what they call those yellow things, clip notes. It's more sophisticated than that, but the idea is the same.
It's a great resource. Join me in thanking you, Marcia.